Those extra baby bottles for the Choices Women's Resource Center fundraiser, those are for CDC. So all of you CDC people that are here, those are for you. You can pick those up on your way out, and we'll do a joint outreach together. We're filling them with change, dollar bills, $100 bills, whatever we have to support their ministry and their efforts. Good morning. So happy that you're here. Welcome to Grace. Those of you that are here, online, outside, CDC, I'm so glad you're here. I got a text from Donald saying, hey, we're in Houston this weekend, so some of the CDC folks might be joining you, so I'm so happy for that. We love the services when you guys are here. All right, let's open our Bibles to two places to start today. Let's open our Bibles to Acts chapter 7 and Exodus chapter 3. The subject of the talk this morning is Grace Church Next Steps. Now, if you're visiting Grace today, or if you're brand new to Grace and you really don't care about our next steps, or you're part of Christian Development Center and you love us and we're connected, but it may or may not affect you, that's okay. There will be a message for you today. This is not going to just be a Grace Church staff meeting, even though I'm going to share something very significant about Grace. But I think there's a message for every person here today. And right after the service today, after I do present what I want to share with you, I'm going to move next door to the cafeteria to do a Q&A session. So we'll finish up in here at 10 o'clock. At 10:30, I would love all of you that would like to. If you're not satisfied with what I present, or if you have additional questions than what I might answer here, we're all going to go this direction. There's a Spanish-speaking church that meets in the fireside room, so there's a lot of multi-uses for this building right now, and we don't want to disturb their service. So we're going to go through the courtyard. Laura will let you in, and we'll do a little Q&A. And then for those of you that are online, I'll also do a Q&A at 2 o'clock this afternoon via Zoom. There's some practical answers to questions that I would like to get into, but I don't want to do it in a live stream format like this. And so I'll share my big reveal to you today. We'll process in person, we'll process online, and then of course we'll continue to process in person. But are you in Acts chapter 7? All right, in Acts chapter 7, Stephen, who will become the first Christian martyr in the New Testament, is rehearsing Israel's history. And as he rehearses Israel's history, he says some very fascinating things about Moses, who would become the great rescuer of the people of Israel out of their bondage and their slavery in Egypt. And in Acts chapter 7, verse 17, Stephen is speaking, and he says, as the time drew near for God to fulfill his promise to Abraham, the number of our people in Egypt had greatly increased. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people and oppressed our ancestors by forcing them to throw out their newborn babies so that they would die. At that time, Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. And I've always loved that line. He was no ordinary child. Well, what an unnecessary line. Have you ever met a parent that said, let me introduce you to my ordinary child? I have never had a grandparent force me to watch them scroll through pictures of my very ordinary granddaughter. No, every parent, every grandparent thinks their kid is extraordinary. When I introduce you to my girls, man, she's a genius. The Avengers are going to be knocking on the door any time now to recruit her for their ranks. I mean, that's how we view our kids. So I don't know why he made that extra statement, but he said, at that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was powerful in speech and action. And when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian. So he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. Now, do you see something here with me? In this passage, this moment occurred, this moment of him killing the Egyptian and trusting that everybody would know that I'm God's choice to be the rescuer. This moment occurred when 40 years old. Moses' life can be divided into three 40-year sequences of time. He spent 40 years living as an Egyptian in Pharaoh's household. He spent 40 years living as a shepherd, taking care of his father-in-law's sheep in the backside of the desert. And then he spent another 40 years leading the nation of Israel out of Egypt and to their promised land. Moses lived for a total of 120 years. Now, we usually think of Moses' calling to be the rescuer of Israel as happening at that moment when God called him from the burning bush. It's a famous story, and we teach our kids the story in children's church. Moses is a shepherd. He's in the wilderness. He sees a bush that's burning, which is not terribly uncommon, by the way. Brush fires happen all the time, except this particular bush wasn't getting consumed. And so after a while, he's like, I've got to check this out. Why is this bush not turning into ash? So he approaches the bush, and God speaks to him from the bush. And God says, Moses, take off your shoes. The ground beneath your feet has just turned holy. Listen, I've heard the cries of my people in their bondage in Egypt, and I am coming down to rescue them, and I'm sending you to lead the charge. That famous moment of God calling Moses to rescue Israel happened when Moses was 80 years old. God called Moses at the bush when he was 80, and yet we just read that 40 years earlier, he kills an Egyptian to show the people that he was God's choice to be the rescuer. So somehow, Moses knew, decades before the burning bush, somehow he knew that God was calling him to be a deliverer. Now, we don't know when Moses figured out what his heritage was. The Bible never tells us when Moses learned who he really was. We don't know when he realized that he was not Egyptian. I suppose it could have happened when he got a little bit older and he realized his features weren't exactly like everyone else's features, although there wasn't a big difference. Ancient Egyptians and ancient Hebrews looked a lot alike. They're from the same part of the world. In fact, there's a moment in Acts chapter 21 when the Apostle Paul gets confused for an Egyptian. In Acts 21:37, it says, as the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, may I say something to you? Do you speak Greek? He replied. Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago? And Paul answered, no, I'm a Jew from Tarsus and Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please, let me speak to the people. So it's possible that Moses always knew who he was. He may have always known that his mother, his stepmother, the Pharaoh's daughter, the princess of Egypt, rescued him. And maybe he always grew up knowing who he was. Or maybe one day his biological sister, Miriam, and brother Aaron had pulled him aside when he was passing by and whispered to him and told him the story, and maybe he believed it. We just don't know. He might have grown up knowing who he was and hating the Egyptians for oppressing the Israelites. And he may have grown up making vows to himself, as soon as I am old enough and strong enough, I'm going to leverage all of the privilege I have as the adopted grandson of the Pharaoh to set these people free. We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us the details. All we know is that somehow Moses understood that God had raised him up to be a mighty rescuer of the people of Israel. And so for me, it's very fascinating to see that 40 years later, after that fierce knowledge of who I am and what I'm called to, 40 years later, when it's finally time to run, Moses responds to God this way. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 11, Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" In chapter 4, verse 10, Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I've never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you've spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." And yet we just read that Stephen said he was actually powerful in speech. Moses was an orator. In verse 13, Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." There are actually 5 times in Moses' interaction with God where he says essentially, "Listen, I'm not your man. I may have thought I was, but please send someone else." So what happened? What happened between the powerful Moses of Exodus 2, who kills an Egyptian with his fist because he's such a rescuer, and the eloquent, confident orator of Acts chapter 7, and then the Moses in the burning bush who says, "You've got the wrong man"? I mean, what happened during those 40 years to produce so much reluctance in him? I think the answer is life. Life happened. And it wasn't necessarily a bad life. There is no indication in Scripture that Moses was unhappy with his life. He was married. He had children. When we read later passages of Scripture, we learn that he had a lot of respect for both his father-in-law and his brother-in-law. And so it wasn't that he had a bad life. It's just he didn't have the life that he had anticipated. And once he fumbled his effort to be the rescuer that God had called him to be, God never seemed to speak to him about it again. Now, maybe he did. The Bible doesn't tell us what God and Moses spoke about, so maybe he did. The Bible just doesn't tell us. Can I lift this idea out of Scripture? And can I lay this on top of your life for a moment? Just because parts of your life have gone in directions that are vastly different from what you thought God would do in you, doesn't mean that God got it wrong. Just because you thought you would rescue Israel at 40 doesn't mean you're not going to rescue them at 80. Just because you felt more powerful and more competent when you were way back then than now. Now you feel much more humbled and broken and fractured and fragile. It doesn't mean that you're less qualified. In fact, you're probably qualified even more. Your humility and your brokenness and your scars. In fact, somebody said once that Christians need to get used to the sight of their own blood. Just because you've seen your own blood a few times, just because you've been a little fractured and you're a little more unstable, doesn't mean you're less qualified. In fact, I don't know if Moses the brawler, Moses who was willing to throw down and actually kill, I don't know if that Moses could have handled the weight of glory that God was going to put on his life. But Moses the worshiper, the barefoot Moses in Sinai, could. The Moses who from Numbers 12 is called the meekest man on earth could. You know, since we're starting the Winter Olympics and we're already loving it, it's making me think of an old movie. And I realize now that I'm 50, and I tried my best to thank everybody for the wonderful cards, so I hope I didn't miss anybody because I was so affirmed. I felt so loved this last week by everybody. But I have to be careful when I make movie references because I can sound ancient now. And I've been thinking about that old John Candy movie, Cool Runnings. Are any of you ancient enough to remember Cool Runnings with me? Okay. It's a great movie. It's hilarious. It's also telling Moses' story. Because these Jamaican sprinters knew that they were destined to be Olympians. They just never imagined it would be in the winter, on ice, and that they'd have to use their sprint speed to push a bobsled down a hill. Moses knew that he was a rescuer. He just didn't know it would take so long, or that it would take the shape that it took. God hardly ever leads people along perfectly straight lines from point A to point destiny. That was true for Moses. It's true for you. And that's also the way that God deals with churches. 25 years ago, Grace Church sold a wonderful little building on White Avenue in Laverne. And we moved into the gymnasium of the Faith Lutheran High School on Fruit Street, thinking that it would be a very temporary stop along the way to a promised land of property along the San Dimas Canyon golf course up against the foothills. At that time, the people who made those moves and went down that path probably thought it would be a pretty straight line. We'll sell the property, or we'll sell the facility, move into the gym, spend a couple years while things are getting ready for us, and then we'll move on to this beautiful facility. We'll continue growing, and we'll all live happily ever after. But fairy tales never go that way, do they? Life doesn't go that way. Epic stories don't go that way. And so the 2 years into the gym turned into 20 years. And after about 20 years of setting up and tearing down and doing church in a gym, we moved to Bonita High School. We had a really good setup there. A lot of people think that was one of our peak times at Bonita. It was a tremendous amount of work, by the way. Behind the scenes, it was a lot of work doing church there, but we loved it. But after being there for a little while, we all ran into something called coronavirus. Do we still call it coronavirus? I haven't heard that term in about a year. Is it still coronavirus, or is it just COVID, or is it the same thing? And that shut us down at the gym. We not only had to abide by restrictions for houses of worship, but also for schools, because we were a church meeting at a school. And that left us more homeless than we had even been in our 25 years without a permanent home. When COVID hit, we didn't even have a temporary home here at Grace. And as COVID cases surged, and as I could read the writing on the wall, and we all knew that we were going to have no place to meet, I went for a walk through my neighborhood to pray. And a lot of you know the story. I was praying in my neighborhood, praying for Grace, praying for you, and a thought came to me to write a letter to all of the pastors in Laverne asking if we could rent from them. And it did not seem like a great idea. Every church was shutting down. Every church was closing its doors. It was not the time to say, hey, can you open your doors to a couple hundred people? But the thought came to me nonetheless. And so I decided to write a little sob story letter to, I didn't want to go much further than Laverne, because this has been our home. This has been our measure since 1901, when we were founded, when Laverne was still called Lordsburg. So I just wrote letters to everybody in Laverne, plus one additional letter to Pastor Don Dirks of Baseline Community Church. Don and I have been friends for years, and Baseline basically sits on the border of Claremont and Laverne. They're about a half mile on the Claremont side of Laverne. So I included him in my little list of please help us out. And Don was the first person to write me back. He wrote me back immediately, and he said, whatever you need. He goes, if you want it on Saturday, it's yours. If you want it Sunday afternoon or Sunday night, anything we can do to help you, great. But then right after hearing from Don, Lincoln Dial, the pastor of this campus, of the school and the church that meets here, he reached out to me. And I had never met Lincoln before, but he's so awesome. He's so gracious and kind, and he said, anything you need. And so they let us use their courtyard out here when we couldn't go inside. And then when we could go inside, they gave us this hour that we have right now before their service to worship together. So awesome, so kind, so gracious. It's been a nice, safe, soft landing for us, but this isn't home. And we've always believed that God had a home for us in the 210 corridor. We've always believed that God has a place for us here with these towns. We are not supposed to be Grace Church Monrovia. We're not called to be Grace Church Brea. God called us here. God called us to this place. And we're debt-free as a church. We have the money that we made from the sale of our property we have not spent. So we've held on to that for the day when another place might open up. But even though we have that money, we don't have near enough money to buy a place. So we have a wonderful church. We have some of the greatest people I have ever known in my life. We have some fantastic ministries. We're a generous church that gives and serves and does our best to model faith, love, and hope for the community. We have money in the bank, but we're stuck. Now, we're wonderfully stuck, but we're stuck. And we're going to need something providential to happen if we're ever going to have our own permanent place here. I know I could find a storefront in Rancho. But I know that God has called us to this region, or I've been convinced of that up to this point. One of the nerdy things that I do as a pastor is I always read the Our Story section of church websites. Anytime I'm on a church website, Isaiah probably does too, I always read the Our History. And they always sound the same. At a certain point, the church came into existence. We did a lot of really great things. We had some ups, we had some downs, we plodded along, and then God opened a door. And then God gave us a building. There's always a big and then God moment. And then God brought this particular pastor, or this happened, and then we were off to the races. And I love reading those stories, except that in the 15 years that Jessica and I have been a part of Grace, we haven't really had the big and then God moment yet. We've had countless little and then God moments, and one little and then God moment is amazing, but we've never yet had the big and then God finally opened a door for Grace Church. We've believed we would have it. We've had people give us words that we would have it. Pastor Donald Rucker has said to me 3 or 4 times, it's coming, God's going to give you a place, and he's said that to me repeatedly, but it hasn't happened. And sometimes people tell me, slow down, we're not there yet. You know, Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness, and we've only been doing this for 25 years. That's bad math, though. Moses lived to 120. I love health and fitness, but I'm not going to be around at 120. If we take those numbers, if you want to follow Moses, if we take those numbers and shrink them into proportion for our lives, I think the wandering time is coming to an end. So in upcoming weeks, I'm going to rehearse a little bit more about our history, some of the incredible things that God has done in and through Grace Church. It's been glorious, but it's also been tough. I cannot tell you how many times pastors have said to me, oh man, my heart goes out to you, brother. We had to set up and tear down for 3 years before God gave us our building. And when they say that, I'm like, in my heart, I just mock. I'm just like, 3 years? Amateurs. We're professionals at doing church in a box. And by the way, if that's our portion as a church, I'm all in. We've had opportunities to go to other churches. If we had wanted a bigger church or a church with a really nice building, we had those opportunities. God called us here. And if our portion is to set up and tear for 20 more years and then Amanda's generation takes it to the next level, I'm in. But I don't think that's God's portion for us to be a church in the box forever. So after all that, here's the big reveal. And then I'll continue this conversation in our Q&A. We have been officially asked, and by officially asked, I mean after a 6-month due diligence, intentional, prayerful, thoughtful process by this other church, we have been asked to take the lead role, and I'll explain what the lead role means, in a potential church merger with Baseline Community Church. As I mentioned, Baseline sits on the border of town and the 210, just on the Claremont side of that border. They have around 4.5 acres of paid-for property that with some renovations, they need some major renovations and overhauling of the facilities, but with the renovations, it could be an amazing campus. They've had an incredible ministry in this community for several decades. They're a very similar church to Grace, but they've reached a point in their journey where they believe that to fulfill their dream of reaching the 210 corridor for God's glory and for the kingdom of God, they need to join forces with another church. So their board, their staff, their ministry team, they spent months praying, researching, assembling data, evaluating, and then they've officially asked us to take the lead role in exploring a merger process. I'm not announcing a church merger today. I'm announcing an aggressive exploration that could move quickly to see if this could and should happen. But in taking the lead role, what that means is if this happened, I would be the lead pastor of the joined church. They have some really great leaders in their church, but they need the kind of staff that we have. So on paper, it's this amazing kind of folding in of our staff members into the needs that are needed and open at Baseline. I've had about 8 meetings over the last year and a half, actually, with pastors from their church. Recently, we had a joint meeting with a delegation of leaders from our board, our staff, their staff. We met to talk. This past week, we had a much larger meeting with our whole staff and board and their staff and board. In fact, Amanda led worship with their worship leader, Kyle. It was amazing. So we had a long worship set and prayer time, and I shared a little bit, and we had a Q&A. Our church, Grace, has had a larger leadership summit meeting. That's all of our small group leaders and department heads. We spent a morning praying together and then processing this. And now today, this has been the culmination for me. I get to process with you. And there's an immediate list of questions that come up when we start talking about this. And I'll start the process of answering those in the Q&A. But I wouldn't be talking to you about this unless it was serious, unless it was well, that's not true. Actually, I blab everything to you, so I would be talking to you. Amanda, go ahead and bring your team up here while I wrap up. I've told you all the little things that come up over the years, but this is more serious than the other things I've told you about. If this happened, we would have an amazing permanent home for our children, for our youth. Isaiah and Christina and Amanda and Laura and Samantha, they're doing an incredible job with our students. But they're also sitting outside in a backyard, which works. But we would have a place. 2 Sundays ago, I watched Cassandra and Naomi and Christina carry boxes up about 4 flights of stairs, hauling their children's stuff back to a little classroom where we store them. We're so grateful for what we have, but I think that God is opening a door. We could have a permanent place that could have a retreat center feel for women, for men, for outreach to the community. And I think the potential could be synergistic. I'm not the best at math. Jessica's crushing her statistics class, by the way. But I'm not the best at math, but I do know that synergy means 1 + 1 is more than 2. Synergy means 1 + 1 is 3 or more. Done well, the potential is that we would have an incredible place and join forces with a group of people who are a lot like us, who are like-minded and want to reach the community. Some people immediately think, well, what about Grace? And we love who we are, and we do, but if 100 people became Christians and joined us, wouldn't we be freaking out and cheering? Wouldn't we be so happy to throw open the doors if God brought a wave of new people to Grace? This would be a similar dynamic, just in a different venue. Of another similar-sized church coming together, it could rescue us, even while it strengthens and supports them. So I want you to be praying. I want you to be very thoughtful. I love Grace Church, and I will not hurt Grace Church, but we need a door to open. We have done an amazing job through COVID, but COVID has hurt, and we need God to give us our final and then God moment. I think this could be it. So the process will let us know if this is it. We're going to begin an intentional process of exploring 25 key questions that you have to wrestle through. We have a team that is going to meet to be working through these steps. The process will make it clear if this is or isn't the direction we're supposed to go. But please still be praying, okay? And if you have questions, join me for the Q&A. If you're happy, if you're satisfied, and you just want to reach out to me later, that's fine. There's no problems. But why don't you stand with me? I also want to mention that I've talked to them about Christian Development Center, and I've told them what an amazing preacher Donald Rucker is. By the way, Ethel is too. I haven't had Ethel preach at Grace yet, but I heard her preach on the Mount of Beatitudes in Israel when Ethel and Donald went to Israel with us. She's awesome. And so I told Baseline about CDC and our friendship and our relationship and the potential, and there's some incredible potential with a few different churches coming together in different ways, and so it could be pretty exciting time. So Jesus, thank you for allowing us to be here. We don't take it for granted that our church has hung in there. We don't take it for granted that we're still assembled and worshiping. That's a big deal, and we're grateful. And Lord, maybe 14 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, Grace couldn't have handled what you want to do. I don't know. I couldn't have. And Lord, I do think we're a little more fractured. We're a little more broken. We're a little more traumatized in our personal lives, maybe as a church. And yet you seem to delight in taking vessels of clay and using them for your glory. You seem to delight in taking human brokenness and letting healing flow out of that place. So I want to ask you, Jesus, to turn Grace, whether we merge or not, turn us into a healing center that reaches more and more and more people with the brilliance, the beauty, the genius, and the life of Jesus. Any person here who feels like their destiny was derailed last week, last year, or a decade ago, remind them that they're still Moses and you're still God. And there are still burning bush encounters to be had. And give us eyes to see it. Thank God Moses didn't go about his way. Thank God he stopped and looked and inquired. Make us an inquiring people and speak to us in that place. Make your will clear. Make the path undeniable. We love you. Let's worship.